I need to say this clearly before anything else. I'm not reporting a haunting. I'm not reporting a disappearance. I'm reporting a discrepancy in route use data for a decommissioned highway segment in Harlan County, and everything that happened to me began with a spreadsheet. My name is Mara Devereaux. I worked as a route compliance analyst for the Kentucky Department of Transportation, District 7. My job, in the most reductive terms, was to make sure the roads we track match the roads people drive. GPS fleet data from commercial carriers gets cross-referenced against our active road inventory. When a truck logs miles on a road that doesn't exist in our system, I get a flag. Most flags are boring. A farmer built an access road that never got permitted. A GPS unit drifted near a county line. A driver left their tracker on while parked at a rest stop, and the signal wobbled for 6 hours. I resolved about 40 flags a month. It was detail work. It was quiet. I was good at it. In March, I was transferred temporarily to the Harlan District Office to assist with what my supervisor in Frankfurt called a legacy data issue. I was told a retiring analyst had left behind an unresolved case file, and they needed someone methodical to clean it up before the office transitioned to a new tracking platform. 2 weeks, maybe 3, simple closure work. I drove down on a Sunday, 4 hours through the kind of Kentucky landscape that shifts gradually from highway corridor to something older, narrow valleys, coal cuts in the hillsides, towns that exist as a gas station and a name on a sign. The district office was a flat-roofed concrete building set back from Route 421, half hidden by a tree line that had been growing unchecked for years. The parking lot had 4 spaces. One of them had an oil stain so deep and dark, it looked like the asphalt was wounded. I parked next to it without thinking, and I mention that because later I realized I parked in the same spot every single time I came back to that building. Not by choice, not by habit, because there was no habit yet on that first day. I just chose it, the way you choose a seat at an empty table. And every time after that, my hands turned the wheel to the same position at the same point in the lot. Glenn Parr was waiting for me inside. He was mid-50s, thin in a way that suggested he forgot meals rather than skipped them. And he had the kind of careful politeness that comes from years of being the only person in a building. He'd set up a desk for me across from his, near the window. There was a coffee maker that he'd already run twice, and the whole office smelled like burnt grounds and old paper. The overhead light buzzed at a frequency I could feel in my molars. On my desk was a mug. Already placed, already filled with black coffee, the temperature exactly drinkable, as though he'd timed my arrival to the minute. I didn't ask about that. It seemed courteous. It seemed like nothing. He shook my hand and said, "I'm glad they sent someone. I wasn't sure they would." I didn't know what that meant yet. The case file was not what I expected. It wasn't a single flag. It was 11 years of flags. 627 individual data entries, all from different commercial carriers, all logging mileage on the same road, a 14.2-mile segment of U.S. Route 119 Alt, running between Colby Creek and a junction point near Bledsoe. The segment had been decommissioned in 1987 after a bypass was completed. The old roadbed had been partially demolished, the signage removed, the surface left to deteriorate. By 1993, according to aerial surveys, vegetation had reclaimed most of it. By 2005, satellite imagery showed no visible road at all. And yet, between 2013 and the present, 627 GPS logs from trucks belonging to 18 different freight companies recorded travel along that exact segment. Speed data suggested normal highway driving, 50-55 miles per hour. Duration was consistent with the distance. Entry and exit points matched the old junction coordinates precisely. I spent the first 2 hours just scrolling. Every entry was the same shape, same road, same speed range, same nighttime window. It was like reading the same sentence written 627 times by 627 different hands. Monotonous, almost soothing. I noticed I'd stopped checking individual timestamps and was just letting the data scroll, absorbing the rhythm of it. Glenn was watching me from his desk. Not staring, just glancing over his glasses every few minutes, the way you watch someone reading a book you've already finished. I asked Glenn why this hadn't been escalated years ago. He took a slow breath and said, "It was, twice. They sent someone in 2016. He drove out to where the road used to be, took photographs of an empty hillside, and wrote it up as a GPS satellite error. Systematic drift, case closed." He paused. Then the flags kept coming, so they sent someone else in 2019. She did the same thing, drove out during the day, found nothing, closed it again. And you reopened it. "I never closed it on my end. I just stopped sending reports to Frankfurt." He said this without defiance, without any particular emotion. The way you'd say you stopped watering a plant that was already dead but kept it on the shelf anyway. Then he added something that I initially wrote off as workplace eccentricity, but that I've since reconsidered many times. "The 2016 analyst stayed 2 days. The 2019 analyst stayed 4. You're the third." He looked at me with an expression I'd later learned to recognize as something between hope and clinical observation and said, "I'm curious how long you'll need." He showed me his own files then, not the state systems flagged as personal records. He'd been tracking the anomaly independently since 2015. He had spreadsheets, printed GPS logs with handwritten annotations, photographs, even fuel purchase records he'd obtained through FOIA requests from the carrier companies. The organizational system was meticulous, color-coded tabs, cross-referenced indices, each entry logged with weather data and lunar phase and a dozen other variables I wouldn't have thought to track. It was the work of someone who had been thorough for so long that thoroughness had become a form of devotion. Every data point confirmed the same thing. Trucks were driving a road that did not exist. But that wasn't the part that unsettled me. The part that unsettled me was the pattern he'd found in the timestamps. Every single log trip occurred between 11:40 p.m. and 4:10 a.m. Every one. Not a single daylight entry in 627 records across 11 years. I said driver behavior. Long-haul routes through rural areas peaked during overnight hours. That's not unusual. Glenn nodded. That's what I told myself for the first 3 years. He opened a drawer and pulled out a binder, thick, discolored, held together with rubber bands that left rust-colored marks on the pages. Inside were printed satellite images, time-stamped. Daylight images showed exactly what you'd expect. Overgrown hillside, no road, trees growing where asphalt used to be. But he also had 4 images captured during late-night orbital passes. In those images, the road was visible. A clear, continuous ribbon of pavement, running 14.2 miles through terrain that, by daylight, showed no trace of it. I looked at those images for a long time. I looked at the metadata. I looked at Glenn. "These could be archival overlays," I said. "A rendering error in the imaging software. If someone loaded a 1985 base map..." "I know," he said. "That's why I drove it." He said it simply, the way you'd say, "That's why I checked the fuse box." And then he told me the first thing I'd later come to think of as a rule. Though he didn't call it that. He called it a finding. He said, "The road is accessible by vehicle from the Colby Creek Junction between approximately 11:50 p.m. and 3:45 a.m. on nights when the temperature drops below 48 degrees and there's no active precipitation. I've confirmed this 17 times." I stared at him. He stared back with the calm, exhausted patience of a man who has been staring at this wall for over a decade and has long since stopped expecting anyone to believe him. "You've driven it," I said. 17 times. A road that doesn't exist during the day. It exists during the day, Mara. You just can't reach it during the day. That distinction would come to matter more than I understood at the time. He had protocols. Of course he did. 11 years of solitary study had produced a system, and the system had rules, and the rules were not arbitrary. I learned them over the next several days, not as a list, but as a series of corrections. Things I assumed that Glenn quietly, firmly revised. The first correction came when I proposed driving to the Colby Creek Junction in daylight to examine the terrain. Glenn said that was fine, encouraged it even, but added, "Don't bring your phone. Leave it in the office. Use the film camera in the equipment closet." When I asked why, he said GPS devices that were present at the junction during daylight hours sometimes logged phantom coordinates for weeks afterward. It poisons the data, he said. I lost 2 months of clean tracking in 2017 because I forgot to leave my phone behind. So I left my phone in my desk drawer. And when I got to the junction, an unremarkable dirt pullout at the base of a wooded hillside, trash in the ditch, a rusted no dumping sign. I spent an hour photographing the terrain and taking soil samples and finding exactly nothing. Just hillside, just trees. I drove back to the office and retrieved my phone, and when I turned it on, I had a missed call from David. The timestamp said 2:47 p.m. I'd been at the junction from 1:30 to 2:30. The call had come while I was standing on the spot where the road should begin, and I remember thinking, I'm glad I didn't have the phone with me because the signal would have corrupted the data. I remember thinking that exact thought, in those exact words, and it felt like my own reasoning, my own professional judgment. It was Glenn's reasoning, his words. I'd adopted them without noticing. The second correction came when I asked about contacting the freight carriers directly to interview drivers who'd logged the anomalous miles. Glenn pulled out a sheet of paper, a list of names, 31 of them, each with a date range. These are the drivers whose GPS units recorded travel on the segment, he said. I contacted 14 of them between 2016 and 2020. Every one of them denied driving the route. Not evasively, genuinely. They had no memory of it. Most of them had no memory of the night in question at all. Just a normal shift, a normal delivery. Nothing unusual. 3 of them got upset with me. One reported me to his dispatcher. He folded the paper. I stopped making calls after that. It wasn't productive, and it was starting to attract the wrong kind of attention. What kind of attention? He hesitated. The first time I'd seen him hesitate about anything. The dispatcher who got the complaint called me back, not to reprimand me, to ask me how I'd gotten the data. He said, and I wrote this down, I had the exact quote. He said, we've been seeing that route show up in our system for 3 years, and we can't figure out where it's coming from. We thought it was your office entering it manually. He thought we were generating the data. I thought they were generating the data. Neither of us was. He looked at me over his glasses. I stopped making calls. I accepted this. It seemed prudent. It also meant that every piece of evidence I had came through Glenn or through systems Glenn had taught me to use. I noted this at the time. I noted it professionally the way you'd note a potential bias in a study. I did not act on it. I told myself I'd verify independently once I had enough context. That threshold kept moving. The third thing I learned, and this one Glenn didn't frame as a correction, he framed it as an observation, was about the road itself. When you drive it, he said, you'll notice it's in perfect condition, not restored, not repaved, perfect. The lines are crisp, the shoulders are clean, there's no debris, no leaf litter, no erosion. It looks the way a highway looks the day it opens. He paused and looked out the window for a moment toward the tree line and continued with the measured voice of someone choosing each word from a very large and carefully organized vocabulary. But it's not new. The guardrails are the old W-beam style they stopped installing in 1991. The signs use the pre-1979 font. The mile markers are in the old format. Everything about it is period accurate to the original road, as if it's not appearing, as if it's persisting, like it never left. He also told me, almost as an afterthought, which I now believe it wasn't, not to stop the vehicle between mile markers 6 and 12. You can slow down, he said. You can observe, but don't come to a full stop in that stretch. I can't tell you exactly why. The 3 times I stopped in that zone, my trip logs afterwards showed timestamps that didn't match my odometer. Small discrepancies. 5 minutes, 8 minutes. Gaps I couldn't account for. After the 3rd time, I made it a policy. I asked him what he thought happened during those missing minutes. He said, I think nothing happened. I think the road just had me for a little longer than I realized. He said it the way you'd say the current carried you a little further downstream than you intended. Annoying. Mildly concerning. Not an emergency. So I added that to my list. Don't stop between 6 and 12. It felt reasonable. It felt like a safety measure based on observed data. It did not feel like training. I want to be clear about that. At no point did I feel like I was being trained. I spent 3 days reviewing Glenn's data before I agreed to drive the route with him. I want to be clear about that, too. I didn't go blindly. I didn't go on faith. I went because the data was clean, internally consistent, and could not be explained by equipment error. I went because I'm an analyst and the numbers were telling me something I couldn't resolve from a desk. But I should mention one other thing about those 3 days. On the second evening, while Glenn was in the restroom, I opened the bottom drawer of his filing cabinet, the one he used for personnel records. It was unlocked. Inside, beneath a stack of old requisition forms, I found a manila folder with my name on it. Inside was a single page, a printout of my transfer authorization from Frankfurt dated March 3rd, standard form, my name, my employee ID, my assigned role, the duration of the temporary posting. The form was dated March 3rd. I received the transfer notification on March 7th. My supervisor told me about it on March 9th. I closed the drawer. I didn't mention it to Glenn. I told myself it was an administrative routing issue. Paperwork moves through district offices before it reaches the analyst pool. That's normal. That's how bureaucracy works. The form arrived at Glenn's office before I was notified. There was nothing unusual about that. I told myself this, and then I told myself something else, which I can't fully recall now, but which I remember feeling deeply persuasive, and which allowed me to set the folder aside in my mind and continue with my work as though I hadn't seen it. I've tried to remember that second thought many times. It's gone. It's just a feeling of resolution where the reasoning should be. We left the office at 11:15 p.m. on a Wednesday. Temperature was 41 degrees, clear skies, no precipitation. Glenn drove. He used his personal truck, an older Ford with a manual transmission and no GPS unit. He'd removed it years ago. The interior smelled like coffee and old cloth, and the bench seat had a long crack in the vinyl that I ran my thumb along without thinking, as if I'd sat in this truck before, which I hadn't. I brought the film camera and a handheld compass, which Glenn said was the only instrument that behaved reliably on the road. He also told me, as we pulled out of the lot, that I should not turn on the truck's radio under any circumstances. He didn't explain why. He said, "I'll explain after. It's easier if you just experience it without that variable." I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't think about turning on the radio. I had, in the span of 5 days, developed a set of behaviors. Leave the phone, use the film camera, don't stop in the middle zone, don't touch the radio, that I followed without resistance. Each one made sense. Each one had a reason, and each one narrowed my range of independent action by exactly 1 degree, so gently that the narrowing felt like focus rather than constriction. The drive to the Colby Creek Junction took 22 minutes. The last 4 miles were on an unlit county road that narrowed until the tree branches formed a tunnel overhead. Glenn slowed to a crawl and turned off the headlights. I nearly grabbed the dashboard, but he said, "Give it a second," and in the darkness I saw it. Ahead and slightly to the right, where daytime photographs showed a hillside choked with 40 years of wild growth, there was a road. Not a faint suggestion, not a trick of shadow. A road, 2 lanes, double yellow center line, white edge markings disappearing into the hills with the gentle authority of mid-century highway engineering. The asphalt caught the moonlight in a way that was almost wet-looking, but wasn't wet. It was the cleanest surface I'd ever seen on a public road. Glenn pulled onto it without ceremony. The tires made a sound, a particular sound, a smooth, high hum that I associate with well-maintained pavement. And we were driving, 50 miles per hour, exactly the speed limit posted on a sign we passed 6 seconds after entry. White rectangle, black numerals, old font. The sign was in flawless condition, not weathered, not faded, not touched by 37 years of rain and frost and ultraviolet exposure. It looked like it had been installed that morning, or like morning had never reached it. For the first 4 miles, I said nothing. I watched the road. I watched the tree line, which was thick and dark and absolutely still. No wind, no animal movement, no other headlights. The compass in my hand pointed north consistently. The road curved gently, following a terrain I recognized from topographic maps of the original 119 alt alignment. Every curve was where it should be. Every grade change matched. It was exactly the road that had been decommissioned and demolished 37 years ago. And it was exactly as Glenn had described it. Not restored. Persisting. At mile 5, I noticed the temperature inside the cab had changed. Not dramatically, perhaps 2 or 3 degrees warmer than it should have been, given the outside air. The heater was off. I didn't mention it. Glenn's hands on the steering wheel were relaxed, his posture settled, and I realized he looked more comfortable here, on this road that didn't exist, than he ever looked in the office. His shoulders were lower. His breathing was slower. He looked like a man driving home. At mile 6, I noticed the stakes. Along the right shoulder, at intervals I later measured as roughly 0.4 miles apart, there were small reflective markers, the kind you'd see on guardrail posts. But they weren't on guardrails. They were on thin wooden stakes driven into the ground just beyond the shoulder. They weren't original to the road. They were placed there by someone. I counted them. Between mile 6 and mile 12, there were 14 stakes. Each one caught our headlights for a brief moment as we passed a small orange flash, rhythmic, almost metronomic. I found myself timing my breathing to them. Inhale at one stake, exhale before the next. I didn't decide to do this. I just noticed I was doing it. At mile 9, Glenn spoke for the first time since we'd entered the road. He said, "Check the compass." I looked down. The needle was pointing south. I tapped the housing. It stayed south. I rotated the compass in my hand. The needle didn't move. It was locked. "It does that between mile 8 and mile 11, Glenn said. "Consistently. Every trip. I don't know why. It corrects itself after the Bledsoe curve." He was right. By mile 12, the needle swung back to north as if nothing had happened. And as it swung, I felt a subtle shift. Not physical, more like a change in pressure. The way your ears adjust when you descend a mountain road. Something released. The trees seemed to pull back half a step from the shoulder. The hum of the tires changed pitch by a barely perceptible degree. It felt like crossing a threshold in the other direction. Like the road had been holding something, and now, past mile 12, it was letting go. We exited the road at 12:31 a.m., emerging onto Route 119 proper near the Bledsoe Junction, and I turned around in my seat to look back. The road was still there. I could see the first 100 yards of it receding behind us, the center line, the clean shoulders. Then Glenn rounded a curve and it was out of sight. I asked him to stop. He did. I got out and walked back to the junction point with the film camera. I took 7 photographs. The air was cold and tasted like iron. Not metallic exactly, but mineral, like the air near a deep well. There was no sound at all. Not insects, not wind, not the tick of the truck's cooling engine, though I'd left the door open. Silence so total it had texture. So total it felt maintained, the way silence in a recording studio is maintained. Not the absence of sound, but the active suppression of it. I walked 20 yards back onto the road. The pavement was solid under my boots. Real. I crouched and touched it. Cool, slightly rough, aggregate surface consistent with 1970s-era highway construction. I pressed my palm flat. It felt like a road. It felt exactly like a road. I stood up and looked down the center line, which ran straight for about a quarter mile before curving left into the dark. And standing there, I felt something I need to describe precisely because it's the part that matters most and the part I trust least. I felt like the road wanted me to keep walking. Not in a supernatural sense. Not a voice, not a pull, not a compulsion. More like the way a well-designed path invites you forward. The way a hallway leads to a door. The road was going somewhere, and I was on it, and the most natural thing in the world was to continue. It wasn't frightening. That was what frightened me. It felt like the most reasonable, comfortable impulse I'd ever had. I went back to the truck. Glenn didn't ask what I'd felt. He just said, "Yeah," as if I'd told him anyway, and we drove back to the office in silence. Over the next week, I drove the road 4 more times. Twice with Glenn, twice alone. He lent me his truck, And by the third trip, I knew the entry conditions and timing well enough to manage it myself. Each trip was consistent. The road was always there, always in the same condition, always silent, always empty. The compass anomaly occurred in the same zone every time. The reflective stakes were always present. The road always felt like an invitation. But there were variations, small ones, the kind I might not have caught if I hadn't been keeping obsessive records. On my second solo trip, I counted the stakes again. 14, same as before. But their spacing had changed, not by much, maybe 10 yards of difference across the full stretch, but enough that my breathing pattern, the one I'd unconsciously adopted, didn't sync the same way. I had to adjust. I adjusted without thinking. The new rhythm felt just as natural as the old one. On my third solo trip, the temperature inside the cab was warmer by the time I reached mile 3. Not mile 5, mile 3, as though the road had learned when to start. I developed my own documentation habits. I logged entry and exit times, odometer readings, temperature, and detailed observational notes. I shot 3 rolls of film. I collected a small asphalt sample using a chisel and a specimen bag. Glenn watched me do it with an expression I couldn't read, something between approval and the way you watch someone sign a contract they haven't fully read. The sample, when I examined it later under the office's magnifying lamp, was unremarkable. Standard bituminous surface mix, no anomalies. I sent it to a materials lab in Lexington under a generic testing request. The results came back normal. It was asphalt. It was real. It was from 1979 or thereabouts, based on the aggregate composition. There was one anomaly in the lab report that I didn't flag at the time. The analysis included a standard contamination check, and the results showed trace biological material, organic compounds consistent with plant resin. Pine sap, essentially. Unremarkable, given that the road was surrounded by forest. But the lab noted that the resin was fresh, not degraded, not fossilized in the asphalt matrix. Fresh, as in deposited within the last 72 hours. The sample had been sealed in a specimen bag in my desk for 9 days. I read the report, I noted the finding, and I moved on. I moved on the way you move past a word you can't quite read in someone's handwriting. Not with resolution, but with the decision not to stall. I've thought about that small act of moving on many times since. It was the most important thing I did, and it wasn't a thing I did. It was a thing the process did through me. By my 5th trip, I'd stopped trying to prove the road wasn't there and started trying to understand why it was. That's when Glenn showed me the other binder. This one was smaller, newer, and kept in a locked filing cabinet I'd assumed held personnel records. The same cabinet where I'd found the folder with my name. Inside were 17 trip logs, Glenn's own. Each one meticulous, each one describing a full traverse of the 14.2-mile segment. But these logs contained a column the others didn't. Encountered. On 4 of his 17 trips, Glenn had encountered another vehicle on the road. The first encounter, in 2016, was a tractor trailer. A white Freightliner with no visible company markings, traveling in the opposite direction at normal speed. It passed Glenn without incident. He noted the license plate. When he ran it later through a contact at the state police, it came back registered to a carrier based in Corbin, Kentucky. The truck had been reported as sold for salvage in 2009. The VIN had been deactivated. The plate number had been reassigned to a different vehicle, a Honda Civic in Lexington. In 2012, somehow on a road that didn't exist, a truck that had been crushed for scrap was still making its run. The second encounter was a passenger car. A dark sedan, older model, parked on the shoulder near mile 10 with its lights off. Glenn slowed as he passed. He said the car appeared empty. He did not stop. He told me that when he glanced in the rearview mirror after passing it, the car was gone, not driving away. Gone. The shoulder was empty. He noted the milepost, and on his next trip, he watched for it. It wasn't there. But on the trip after that, it was. Same car, same spot, same posture on the shoulder. Still empty. He said he'd come to think of it as a fixture, like the stakes, part of the road's furniture. The third encounter was the one he told me about last, and the one he told me about most carefully. In 2021, at approximately 1:15 a.m. near mile 7, Glenn came around a curve and found a figure standing on the center line. A woman, middle-aged, dark hair, wearing a green jacket. She was facing his direction, but not moving. Not flagging him down, not reacting to his headlights, just standing. He stopped the truck about 40 yards away. He sat there for what he estimated was 2 full minutes. She didn't move. He said, and this is what made me put down the binder. He said she looked like someone he knew. Not someone famous, not someone from a dream, someone specific and real from his life. Someone he hadn't seen in years. He wouldn't tell me who. He reversed the truck and drove back to the Colby Creek entry point. When he reached it, the road behind him was gone. He was sitting in his truck on a dirt patch at the base of an overgrown hillside, engine running, headlights illuminating nothing but trees. He didn't drive the road again for 4 months. I asked him about the fourth encounter. He shook his head. That one's in the log. You can read it. I'm not going to talk about it. I read it. The entry was short, almost terse, in handwriting that was tighter and more controlled than his other logs, as though the pen itself was being held accountable for precision. March 8, 2023, entry 11:52 p.m., traversal normal to mile 11. Encountered vehicle following at approximately 200 yards. No headlights, maintained speed. Vehicle maintained distance. Exited at Bledsoe 12:24 a.m. Following vehicle did not exit. Returned to office. Checked rearview camera footage. Below that, in different ink, added later, footage shows empty road behind truck for entire traversal. No vehicle visible at any point. And below that, in pencil, in handwriting, so faint I had to hold the page under the lamp, but the footage is 4 minutes longer than the drive. I read that entry 3 times. Then I closed the binder and looked at Glenn, who was sitting at his desk doing something with a pencil and not meeting my eyes. You have a rear view camera, I said. I installed it in 2020. And it didn't see the car. It didn't see the car. But you saw it. In the mirror, with my eyes, for 13 miles. And the footage was 4 minutes longer than the trip. He said nothing. Glenn, the footage was 4 minutes longer. I know. What was in the extra 4 minutes? Road, he said. Just road. The same view, the same empty stretch behind the truck. But 4 more minutes of it, as though the camera kept recording after I stopped, or the road kept going after I left. We sat with that for a while. The overhead light buzzed. Somewhere outside, a single bird made a sound. The first natural sound I'd heard at that office after dark, and then stopped. I didn't hear it again. This is the point in the story where I want to describe a feeling that I'm not sure I have the right language for. It wasn't fear, and it wasn't excitement, and it wasn't the analytical detachment I'd been relying on. It was the feeling of sitting in a pattern and realizing the pattern includes you, that you are not studying the data. The data anticipated you. It made room for you. Your name was in a folder before you were told you were coming. The coffee was the right temperature. The desk was already arranged. And you sat down and began. And it felt like beginning, but now you suspect it felt like continuing. Like something had been waiting for you to arrive so the next part could happen. And you don't know what the next part is. And you're not sure the feeling is yours. I should have left. I want to make that explicit, not as self-recrimination, but as a data point. The rational response to what I'd seen and documented, a road that exists outside normal temporal parameters, data that contradicts physical evidence, footage that records more time than elapsed, a filing cabinet that contained my transfer papers. Before the transfer was authorized, the rational response was to escalate the report, hand over the files, and return to Frankfurt. Here's what I actually did. I requested a 3-month extension on my assignment. I told my supervisor in Frankfurt that the data issues were more extensive than anticipated and required continued on-site analysis. He approved it without questions. No questions at all. I'd expected pushback. Budget constraints, project timelines, the usual friction. Nothing. He just said, take what you need. in a tone I've heard before from people signing off on something they don't fully want to know about. I called my husband, David, and told him the same thing. He was quiet for a moment and then said, "You sound different." I asked him what he meant. He said, "I don't know, like you're excited about something." I told him I wasn't excited. I told him it was just a complicated project. I wasn't lying exactly, but I wasn't telling the truth in any way that mattered. The truth was that I'd already decided to drive the road alone 3 more times. The truth was that I'd already started thinking of the Colby Creek Junction as the entrance. Not the site, not the junction, the entrance. The truth was that when I looked at the daytime hillside where the road should be, I felt the same thing I felt when I look at a house with the lights off and know someone is inside. The absence wasn't empty, it was withheld. Because the road was exciting, not in a thrill-seeking way, not in an adrenaline way. In a way I can only describe as recognition. Like finding a door in your own house that you'd somehow never open. Like realizing a room exists that was always there, that was always yours, and you'd just been walking past it for decades. The road felt like it belonged to me, or I belonged to it. That distinction, like the one Glenn made between the road appearing and the road persisting, turned out to matter enormously, and I didn't understand it until too late. My 6th trip was on a Friday night, alone. Temperature 39 degrees, clear, no wind. I entered at 11:51 p.m. and drove at a steady 50. The road was as it always was. Immaculate, silent, dark on both sides. The center line unspooling ahead of me like a thought I was following to its conclusion. At mile 3, the cab was already warm. At mile 5, I realized I'd been humming a tuneless, rhythmic sound, synchronized to the stake flash pattern I hadn't yet reached. I stopped humming. The silence that replaced it felt wrong. Incomplete, like I'd removed a part from a machine and the machine was now running rough. At mile 7, I passed the spot where Glenn had seen the woman. There was no one there, but I slowed. Not to a stop, I remembered the rule, but to about 30. And as I did, I glanced at the passenger seat. The film camera was sitting where I'd placed it. Beside it, the compass. And beside the compass, at an angle that suggested it had been set down rather than tossed, was a pen, a blue ballpoint pen with a chewed cap. It was Glenn's pen, and I'd seen it on his desk 100 times. The chew marks were distinctive. He worked the cap with his front teeth when he was thinking, a habit he didn't seem aware of. I had not brought a pen. I had not brought anything that belonged to Glenn. The truck was Glenn's, but I'd checked the cab before departing. A habit I'd developed without being told to, clearing the seats and the dashboard so that anything I found during the trip could be attributed to the road and not to prior contents. The cab had been clean. I picked up the pen. It was warm. Not from sunlight, not from the heater. Warm the way a pen is warm when someone has just been holding it. I put it in my jacket pocket. I kept driving. The compass reversed at mile 8 and corrected at mile 12. The road was the same. Everything was the same. The pen was warm in my pocket the whole time. When I got back to the office and set it on Glenn's desk, it was cold. At mile 9 on that same trip, the compass reversed. At mile 11, it corrected. But at mile 10, exactly mile 10, I noted the odometer. I saw something new. On the left shoulder, facing the road, was a small sign. Not a highway sign, a wooden sign, hand-painted, the kind you might see at the entrance to a rural property. White background, black letters. It said, Survey Marker 7. I didn't know what it meant. Glenn had never mentioned it. It wasn't in any of his logs. I noted it and kept driving. At mile 12, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw headlights. They were distant, a quarter mile, maybe more. And they were the wrong color. Not white, not yellow. A pale amber, like sodium vapor lamps. Like the lights over an old parking lot. They held steady behind me. I maintained speed. I remembered Glenn's log. I remembered that his camera saw nothing. I had no camera. I'd removed it from the truck during the clearing process. Another one of my protocols that I'd developed without quite deciding to. Another behavior that felt like professional diligence and might have been something else. I had only the mirror in my eyes, and my eyes told me someone was behind me. I drove the last 2 miles at exactly 50 miles per hour with my hands at 10 and 2 and my breathing deliberately slow. The headlights never gained, never fell back, never flickered. They were simply there, maintaining a distance that felt chosen. Maintained the way the silence was maintained, the way the temperature was maintained, precisely, deliberately in a way that implied not randomness, but calibration. I exited at Bledsoe at 12:22 a.m. I pulled over immediately and got out and looked back toward the junction point. The road was visible for about 60 yards behind me before it curved away. No headlights, no vehicle, no sound. I stood there in the cold for 5 minutes, watching. Nothing emerged, but the silence, the total textured silence, was there again, and this time it seemed to have a boundary. I could hear my own breathing, my own heartbeat, the creak of my jacket when I shifted my weight. But beyond a certain distance, maybe 20 feet in every direction, the world produced nothing. As though a sphere of quiet had followed me off the road and was standing here with me, patiently, waiting for me to go back. I drove to the office. Glenn was there, which surprised me. It was nearly 1 a.m. He was sitting at his desk with the overhead light off, working by the glow of his desk lamp. And when I came in, he looked up and said, "Did you see it?" I sat down across from him. "Headlights, behind me. Mile 12 to exit." He nodded. "How did you know?" "It's Friday." I waited. "They always appear on Fridays, between mile 11 and the exit." "I don't know why Fridays. I've checked for other weekly patterns. It's only Fridays." He let that settle. Then he opened his desk drawer and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a printout from the state GPS monitoring system, the same system I used in my regular work. It showed a real-time tracking dot for a commercial vehicle, a tanker truck operated by a carrier out of Middlesbrough. The dot was sitting on Route 119 near Bledsoe. The timestamp was 12:22 a.m., the exact minute I'd exited. "This truck," Glenn said, "is currently parked at a fuel depot in Virginia. It has been since 6 p.m. I confirmed with the carrier 20 minutes ago." "Then why is it showing?" "Because it drove the road tonight. Or the road drove it. The data appeared about an hour ago. It'll be gone by morning. It always is. The flags I've been tracking for 11 years. They aren't ghosts in the system, Morrow. They're live. Something is traveling that road in real time, using the identities of real trucks and real drivers, and the only trace it leaves is in the data. The drivers don't remember because the drivers were never there." I sat with that. The office hummed. The coffee maker gurgled faintly, even though neither of us had turned it on. "Then who's driving?" I asked. Glenn folded the paper and put it back in the drawer. "I don't think anyone is. I think the road is driving itself. And I think every time we go out there, we teach it a little more about what traffic looks like." He said it the way you'd say a river learns its bank, not metaphorically, observationally. And then he said something he'd never said before. "I found your pen on the passenger seat, by the way. After your trip, you must have left it." "I didn't bring a pen." "Blue ballpoint, chewed cap." "That's your pen, Glenn. I found it on the seat when I was driving. I put it on your desk." We both looked at his desk. The pen was there, exactly where I'd set it. Glenn reached over and picked it up and turned it slowly, looking at the chew marks. His chew marks. "I haven't taken this pen out of the office in 3 years," he said. He put it down. We didn't discuss it further. There was a protocol forming between us. Not spoken, not written, but real. Certain observations got logged. Certain observations got spoken aloud, acknowledged, and then released. As if saying a thing was enough. As if documentation was a form of digestion, and once something was recorded, it no longer needed to be understood. I recognize this now as the most dangerous behavior I adopted. The habit of noting without reacting. Of seeing without feeling what I saw. It made me an excellent observer. It also made me something else. Manageable. I didn't go home that weekend. I told David I was behind on documentation. He said, "Okay, just that." I could hear the television in the background, the specific sound of our living room, the space, the echo off the hardwood, the particular murmur of a show he'd watch without me. It sounded foreign. It sounded like a place I'd visited once. I tried to picture the room, our couch, the lamp, the stack of books on the side table that I'd been meaning to sort for a year. And the image was there, accurate, detailed, but flat. Like a photograph of a place instead of the place itself. The road, by contrast, I could feel. The hum of the tires, the warmth of the cab, the rhythm of the stakes. I could summon those sensations instantly, vividly, with more fidelity than my own living room. I slept on the cot Glenn kept in the supply closet. I spent Saturday reviewing every data point, every photograph, every trip log. I built a timeline. I cross-referenced the weather data, lunar cycles, traffic volumes on surrounding roads. I was looking for a pattern beyond the one Glenn had already found, and I did find one, and I wish I hadn't. The road's activity was increasing. In 2013, the first year of recorded anomalies, there were 9 flagged trips. In 2018, there were 41. In 2023, there were 112. The frequency was accelerating, and it was accelerating in a way that correlated with something I almost missed, the reflective stakes on the shoulder. Glenn had placed the first stakes in 2016. He'd added more on subsequent trips. Surveyors have it, he said, marking reference points. He had 14 now, between mile 6 and mile 12. The acceleration in road activity mapped almost exactly to the number of stakes, not in a linear way. I'm not claiming direct causation, but the curve matched. Each time Glenn added a new marker, the average monthly flag count increased within the following quarter. The correlation coefficient was 0.94. In my field, anything above 0.8 gets your attention. Anything above 0.9 keeps you awake. I brought this to Glenn on Sunday morning. He was quiet for a long time. He got up and poured coffee that I hadn't heard him brew and stood by the window, and the light came in gray and thin and made him look like a photograph of himself. Then he said, "I thought it might be something like that." "You're feeding it," I said. "Every marker you place, every trip you make, every log you keep, you're reinforcing it. You're making it more real." Or I'm documenting something that's becoming more real on its own, and my documentation is just keeping pace. Glenn, I know what it sounds like. Do you? Because from where I'm sitting, and it sounds like you spent 11 years maintaining a road that shouldn't exist, and now it's busier than some of our active highways. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and said something that I think about every day. He said, "Mara, why did you ask for a 3-month extension?" I didn't answer. "You feel it too," he said. "The road wants to be used. It wants to be known. It wants to be driven. And the more attention you give it, the more it gives back. I'm not feeding it. We're commuting on it. We're becoming part of its traffic pattern. And honestly," he took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes, and for a moment he looked old, genuinely old, worn down to wire and habit. "Honestly, I don't think it matters whether we stop. I think it's past that." "What do you mean?" "Check the latest satellite image, the one from last Tuesday's overnight pass." I pulled it up on the office computer. The image was grainy. Nighttime orbital photography always is. But the road was clearly visible. All 14.2 miles, in better definition than any previous image. And extending beyond the old Bledsoe Junction by what appeared to be another 4 miles, curving south towards a destination that, on every daytime map, was just forested hillside. The road was growing. I stared at the image. I zoomed in. At the leading edge of the new section, right where the pavement ended and the unbuilt road presumably began, there was a small shape on the shoulder. Tiny, just a few pixels, but consistent with every other image I'd seen of them. A reflective stake, already in place, on a stretch of road that hadn't existed in the previous image set. A marker for a section that was just being built, placed there as though someone had surveyed it in advance. As though someone had been expecting it to grow exactly this far. Glenn was watching me. I looked up at him. He was standing by the window with his coffee, and his expression was the one I'd seen when I chiseled the asphalt sample. Not approval, not concern, recognition. Like he'd seen this exact moment before, from the other side of the desk, when he was the one finding the images and there was no one else in the room. I didn't ask about the stake. I logged it. I noted the coordinates, the image timestamp, the estimated length of the new section. I recorded everything. It was my job. It was what I was trained to do. Trained by the state, trained by the data, trained by Glenn, trained by the road, and I was no longer fully certain which training was which, and I noted that too in a margin annotation that I can still read in my files. Unclear whether documentation practice is serving the analysis or the subject. I wrote that, I looked at it, and then I continued working. I drove the road one more time. I need you to know that. I drove it one more time, and I told myself it was for documentation purposes, and I brought the film camera and the compass and a digital audio recorder, and I entered at 11:48 p.m. on a Monday night in April, temperature 44 degrees, and the road was there and it was beautiful. I don't know how else to say it. It was beautiful. The pavement was perfect. The lines were perfect. The darkness on either side was total and soft, like velvet, like sleep, and the road ahead was clear and endless, and I was driving it, and it was mine. And for 14 miles, I did not think about David or Frankfurt or data flags or any of the small grinding machinery of my actual life. I thought about nothing. I felt held, the way water holds you if you stop fighting it, the way sleep holds you in the last seconds before you lose the surface. At mile 3, the cab was warm. At mile 5, I was humming. At mile 6, the stakes began, and my breathing synced, and the humming synced, and for a stretch of miles, I was something I'd never been in my waking life, perfectly rhythmic. Every system in me, respiratory, vocal, autonomic, locked to the road's pulse, and it felt like health, like order, like the opposite of the low-grade static that I'd always carried and never named. At mile 7, I saw her, the woman in the green jacket. She was standing on the center line, exactly where Glenn had described, facing me, not moving. I slowed, I stopped. I left the engine running and the headlights on, and I looked at her through the windshield. She looked like my mother. Not my mother as she'd been when she died. Diminished, confused, asking for people who'd been gone for years, her voice thin and searching and wrong. My mother as she'd been when I was 12. Specific, real. The green jacket was one I remembered. She'd worn it every fall. The zipper pull was a small brass leaf. The way she stood was right. Her weight on her left foot, her head tilted slightly. The way she used to stand in the kitchen doorway watching me do homework. Not interrupting, just present. Everything was right. She didn't speak. She didn't gesture. She just stood there in my headlights on a road that didn't exist, looking at me with an expression of such patient, familiar expectation that I put the truck in park. I was between mile 6 and mile 12, the zone where I was not supposed to stop. I stopped, and I did not think about the rule. The rule simply wasn't there. It had been in my mind for weeks, governing every trip, and in this moment it was gone. The way a word leaves you mid-sentence and not forgotten, just absent, as though it had been removed by a hand reaching in from outside the frame. I put the truck in park, and I opened the door, and I put one foot on the pavement. The audio recorder was running. I've listened to it since, 11 times. On the recording, there is the sound of the engine, the sound of the door opening, the sound of my boot on asphalt, and then very faintly a sound I can only describe as the road breathing. A low rhythmic pulse coming from everywhere, coming from the surface itself. It lasts for 11 seconds on the recording. Exactly 11 seconds. I've timed it. 11 seconds and then silence, and then the sound of my boot again as I shift my weight. I don't remember hearing it. I remember silence. Total, warm, held silence. I remember looking at my mother, and I remember wanting to walk to her, and I remember that it didn't feel like a choice. It felt like continuing, like the next mile of a drive I'd already committed to. The destination had always been here. Every trip, every rule, every protocol had been pacing toward this point, this exact point, and all I had to do was continue. And continuing meant stepping forward, and stepping forward meant walking the road, and the road was warm, and the road was mine, and my mother was standing there in the fall jacket with the brass leaf. And I could almost smell the kitchen, almost hear the radio she always kept on, almost feel the specific texture of the linoleum under my socks, and my phone rang. My phone, which I'd left in the office per Glenn's protocol. My phone, which was not in the vehicle. It rang. David's ringtone, the specific three-note pattern I'd assigned him. And it was coming from the passenger seat where nothing sat but the camera and the compass. 3 notes, then silence, then 3 notes again. Patient, insistent, real. I looked at the passenger seat. There was no phone. The ringing was coming from the seat itself, or from the air above it, or from somewhere so close that direction didn't apply. It rang 3 more times. I counted. Then it stopped. The woman was gone. The road ahead was empty. The center line ran straight and clean into the darkness, and the darkness was no longer soft. It was just dark. I got back in the truck. I closed the door. My hands were shaking, and this is significant because they hadn't been shaking when I stepped out. They started shaking when the phone stopped ringing, as though the ringing was the last thread connecting me to a system of reactions that I'd been slowly unlearning, that the road had been slowly teaching me to release it. And when it sounded, all the suppressed responses flooded back at once. Shaking hands, rapid pulse, a cold that started in my sternum and radiated outward. I drove the remaining 7 miles in a state I cannot accurately describe. I was calm. I was aware. I was not afraid. I noticed that the compass never deviated for the first time. No reversal in the 8 to 11 zone. I noticed that there were no reflective stakes. Not missing, not fallen over. The ground where they'd been was smooth, unbroken shoulder, as though they had never been placed. I noticed that the road surface near mile 13 showed hairline cracks, tiny fractures in the pavement, as though something under the surface was shifting or growing or breathing in a way that asphalt was never meant to accommodate. I noticed all of this. I felt none of it. The noticing and the feeling had been separated cleanly, precisely, the way you'd separate 2 sheets of paper that had been stuck together. I could see the edges where they'd once been joined. I exited at Bledsoe. I drove to the office. It was 12:40 a.m. Glenn was not there. His truck was in the parking lot. His desk lamp was on. His coffee was still warm. I touched the mug without thinking, the way you'd touch a surface to confirm it's real. The coffee was the exact temperature of drinkable, the same temperature as the mug he'd had waiting for me on my first day. But Glenn was not in the building. I checked every room, the supply closet, the restroom, the lot, the tree line. I called his name. My voice sounded strange in the parking lot, too loud, too present, as though the silence that had been following me from the road resented the interruption. On his desk, centered neatly, aligned with the edges of his blotter with the precision of someone who had all the time in the world, was a single sheet of paper with his handwriting. Trip 18, entry 11:47 p.m. conditions nominal, going to walk the last mile. I think I understand now. Below that, in the same pen, in the same steady hand. The road doesn't take you anywhere. It takes you back. It takes you back to the last place you felt like you belonged. And it's patient. And it's right. That was 9 days ago. Glenn's truck is still in the lot. The oil stain beneath it has darkened by a shade that might be my imagination and might not. His personal effects are in his desk, his binder, his data, his 11 years of logs, all here. His pen is on his desk, the cap chewed, positioned exactly where I set it after my 6th trip. I filed a missing persons report on Tuesday. The state police searched the Colby Creek area and the Bledsoe Junction. They found nothing. No road, no sign of foot traffic, no Glenn. The officer who led the search was professional and thorough and told me, as he was leaving, that the area showed no signs of recent human activity whatsoever. No footprints, no tire marks, no broken branches. "Ma'am," he said, "nobody's been out here in years." The daytime satellite image from Wednesday shows forested hillside, unbroken, no pavement. But the latest GPS flag came in yesterday morning. A refrigeration unit out of Pikeville, logging 14.2 miles on a decommissioned highway at 2:07 a.m. The driver, when contacted, said he'd had an uneventful shift. Didn't remember anything unusual. Sounded slightly annoyed at being asked. And the flag showed something new. The route extended 4.6 miles past the old Bledsoe Junction. Longer than the last satellite image suggested. Growing. And at the terminus of that new section, the GPS data showed something it had never shown before. A stop. The truck, or whatever the data said was, a truck had come to a full stop for 6 minutes and 14 seconds before the signal vanished. 6 minutes, 14 seconds. The exact duration to the second of my audio recording from the last trip. The recording of the road breathing. I've requested a transfer back to Frankfurt. It was approved this morning, instantly. No questions, no paperwork delays. The authorization was already in the system when I submitted the request. Timestamp 4 hours before I'd made my decision to leave. I stared at that timestamp for a long time. Then I closed the screen. Then I noted it. Then I continued packing. I'm not going to drive the road again. I need to say that. I need to put it in writing in this document so that it exists as a record of my intention, because I've noticed something about myself over the last 3 days that I cannot ignore, and that I am documenting here with the same precision I've applied to every other data point in this case. Every night around 11:30, I find myself checking the temperature. Not deliberately, reflexively. The way you'd glance at a clock when you're waiting for someone. The way you'd check your mirror on a long drive. A behavior so small and so embedded that I only catch it after it's happened. My eyes sliding to the weather display on the office computer. My skin registering the air from the parking lot when I step outside for no reason I can name. Last night it was 46 degrees and clear, and I stood in the parking lot for 20 minutes looking south toward Colby Creek. And the most honest thing I can tell you is that the road felt close. Not visible, not audible, but close. Like a conversation in another room. Like a door you know is unlocked. Like someone standing behind you who hasn't yet decided to speak. My mother has been dead for 7 years. David and I haven't spoken in 6 days. The last time I called, he answered on the second ring and said my name like a question, and I couldn't remember what I'd planned to say. The specimen bag with the asphalt sample is still on my desk. Sealed, labeled, untouched since the lab returned it. But I weighed it yesterday, and I weighed it again this morning, and it's heavier, by 0.3 grams. Asphalt doesn't gain weight. Asphalt doesn't change. Material sealed in a specimen bag for 2 weeks does not accumulate mass. I checked the scale. I recalibrated it. I weighed a control sample. The scale is accurate. The asphalt is heavier. And it's warm. Through the bag. The faintest warmth, barely perceptible. The kind you could dismiss as your own body heat reflected back. And that is what I am dismissing it as. Here, in this document, officially. Body heat, my own warmth returned to me. I'm driving back to Frankfurt in the morning. I'll leave by 9 a.m. I'll take 421 to the interstate, and I will not deviate, and I will not stop at Colby Creek, and it will be daylight, and none of this will matter in daylight. The road doesn't exist in daylight. It doesn't exist in daylight. I've seen the satellite images. I've walked the hillside. In daylight, there is nothing there. I just need to not check the temperature again tonight. It's 11:22 p.m. I should stop writing and go to sleep. The office is very quiet. Glenn's coffee maker is still here. I haven't turned it on since he disappeared. But there's a smell, faint, intermittent, coming and going like a signal, of fresh coffee, brewed coffee. Not the stale, burnt ground smell that lives in the machine's plastic housing. Fresh, as though someone just poured a cup in another room. A room I can't find, in a building that only has 3 rooms. Outside, the parking lot light flickers in a rhythm I've been trying not to count. I've been trying not to count it because I already know what rhythm it is. It's the stake rhythm, the breathing rhythm, the rhythm my body learned on the road, and that the road is now playing back to me through a 40-watt sodium lamp in a parking lot in Harlan County. I'm not going to check the temperature. I'm going to close this file and lie down on the cot, and in the morning, this will be behind me. The thing I can't stop thinking about, the thing I need to say before I close this file, is that Glenn's last note said he was going to walk, not drive, walk, as if after 17 trips, the truck was no longer the point, as if the road had been teaching him, slowly over 11 years, that the vehicle was just how you got introduced, that the real invitation was to step out and stay, and the protocols, don't bring your phone, don't use digital instruments, don't stop in the middle zone, don't turn on the radio. Every one of them stripped away a layer of connection to the outside. Every one of them made the road more complete and the world less present. I followed them all. I followed them because they were logical. I followed them because Glenn explained them. I followed them because the road rewarded compliance with beauty and warmth and silence in the face of my dead mother standing in the headlights looking like she'd been waiting for me. Just waiting, the way she used to wait, and I almost walked to her, and the only thing that stopped me was a phone that wasn't there, ringing with a call from a husband whose voice I can barely remember. In a house I can describe but no longer feel. On a street I could drive to in 4 hours. But that feels further away tonight than a road that doesn't exist. I felt it, at mile 7, when I opened the door and put my foot down. The road was warm through my boot sole, even though the air was 44 degrees. It was warm the way skin is warm, the way a hand is warm when someone has been holding something for you, keeping it ready, keeping it the right temperature for a very long time. I'm not going to check the temperature. I'm not. It's 11:34. It's 43 degrees. I know because the weather display is visible from the cot. I didn't get up. I didn't check. I can see it from here. I've always been able to see it from here. The desk is angled so that the screen faces the supply closet door, and I never adjusted it, and Glenn never mentioned it. And it's 43 degrees and clear, and there is no precipitation, and the parking lot light is flickering in a rhythm I can feel in my breathing, and the coffee smell is stronger now, and somewhere south of here, past the tree line and down the county road and through the dark tunnel of branches. The road is there, and it's warm, and it's patient, and the last thing I'm going to write in this file is that I understand now what Glenn meant. He meant it's not a road you find, it's a road that commutes, and I think it's almost here.